The Texas coast is special to me, and my family has made countless memories there. This spring, it's time for you to do the same in Port Aransas. It's a place where family traditions naturally unfold, and you'll find beauty in the island views while taking time to relax between adventures. Just one visit, and you'll see why generations of Texans have anchored their traditions to the island life. Start your new favorite family tradition in Port Aransas, Texas. Plan your visit to Houston's beach at visitportaransas.com. Hey parents, are you looking for ways to give your high school student a competitive edge while enriching their education? Then you need to check out the Rice University Pre-College Program. It's fully online and the courses are designed to challenge and inspire. This program provides a unique opportunity for your teen to explore their interests with engaging online courses in a variety of subjects like medicine, STEM, business, and more. Help your high school student prepare for the rigor of college academics while learning valuable skills. To learn more, check out precollege.rice.edu. That's precollege.rice.edu. This episode of CityCast Houston contains some descriptions of violence that might make some listeners uncomfortable. So if you're listening right now with the kids in the car, maybe you listen later on your headphones.
Today on CityCast Houston, it sounds like an urban legend or horror film. A man selling candy to kids only to be a serial killer. But this Candyman was real and murdered dozens of teenage boys in Houston. We're going to talk about how this crime changed our city and why it still haunts families today. It's Monday, March 31st. I'm Laura Eisensee, filling in for Raheel Ramsanali, and here's what Houston's talking about. I want to welcome in Lisa Olson, who's an investigative journalist and just published her latest book about the Candyman called The Scientist and the Serial Killer. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Laura.
That scientist in the book title is Dr. Sharon Derrick. She's a forensic anthropologist who worked for years at the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office, and she's joining us today as well. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you, Laura.
Lisa, can you give people who haven't heard of the case just a quick overview of what happened?
So what happened was over the course of 3 years, Dean Corll, who owned a bunch of candy stores in the Heights with his mother, started to kidnap and kill kids in that neighborhood and other surrounding areas, mainly in Houston, but also in Pasadena. And these kids were, kids walking to the store or riding their bike to their job or, going to the pool, and they were snatched off the street. He also used a pair of teenagers who went to school in the Heights to help convince other kids to come to his house to go to, quote, parties from which they would never return. He tortured and raped and killed kids in a variety of addresses that he rented for short periods of time. There were more than 36 locations associated with him. He just kept moving so that no one would ask any questions. And his crimes were totally undetected by the police. There were only 2 open murder cases when 27 sets of remains were found in December 1973. So the police did not detect what he was doing. And the kids who tried to raise the alarm say that they weren't heard.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, there's so many shocking layers to this crime, but that piece of how the killer, the Candyman, Dean Corll, how he got away with it for so long.
He developed tools to help hide his crimes. He devised a way to keep boys immobile so that he could hold them for long periods that he called a torture board. He used what he called a murder box to transport their bodies so that if he was pulled over while transporting remains to these different burial sites, that police wouldn't be able to see anything. Maybe they'd smell something, but they wouldn't see anything. And he was very stealthy. He also was well known in the neighborhood where he was doing this. Some of the murder victims' parents knew him as the Candyman, so they trusted him. In one case, parents of a missing boy asked him if he had seen their child, and of course he said no.
Oh my gosh, it gives you goosebumps. This crime is so horrific, but it happened over 50 years ago now. And for a lot of Houstonians, it may just sound like a bizarre urban legend. What would you tell them?
I think it's the scariest serial killer that you've never heard of. And the reason is Dean Corll was killed by one of his accomplices. And so he never lived for years to boast on death row about his exploits the way another serial killer of the 70s, Wayne Gacy, did. But Corll killed nearly as many people, maybe more than Gacy, and hid them in 3 different places, not just in his home, but in a shed and in the woods and on the beach. And the truth is, as Sharon Derrick discovered, there are likely more victims whose bones have not yet been discovered. And there were only about 2/3 of the victims identified at the time in 1973. And so one of the reasons the case is still relevant is because there are a lot of families that were still searching for answers in the 2000s and 2010s and even today. And Dr. Derrick's group work helped give them answers and also raise new questions about this case and why it's relevant now.
Sharon, like if someone has that misconception that, oh, this is a bizarre urban legend, like, oh, it's a rumor, a story of the Heights, like, how would you react?
Well, it's interesting that you say that because I just had that happen to me a couple of days ago. I was talking about the cases in one of my classrooms, and somebody said, "Oh, I heard that that was just made up, that that was just to scare people so that they would come home at night and not hang out with their friends." And I said, "Oh, really?" And so that is a prevailing rumor right now, is that it's just all made up. And so I started talking about the cases in class. And what I saw when I first walked into that cooler where the boys had been stored that were not identified. And one girl started to retch like she was going to throw up. And so I stopped and I said, "See, it is real."
It is very real. And I want to stay with you, Sharon, because the narrative of this case changed when you joined the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office back in 2006. Nobody assigned you to the Houston mass murders, as it was called, and you got involved almost by accident. You mentioned this cooler. Tell me about how you stumbled into this.
Well, I had gone into the cooler where the bodies are stored before they go into the autopsy suite for their autopsy. And then some of the deceased persons they couldn't find relatives for would be stored in there so that, not to be too gross about it, but so that they would not decompose. So they're in there. And I went in to get a box that were skeletal remains that I was going to work on as one of the anthropologists. And I saw this other box over there, and it said in big, huge letters on it, 1973 mass murders, do not touch. And of course, I touched it, right? Because that's what I do. Mm-hmm. And I went over and pulled it out. And then I started asking our assistant medical examiner at the time, Dr. Dwayne Wolf, what is this? And he said, "Well, do you want to work on it? I think you have the skills to work on it." And so we opened it up, and he explained to me that there was a file and that I could go read what was in the file and get a good idea of what this represented.
What was it about these mass murders, these lost boys who you find these remains in the cooler and then you start working on it, like on the side, in addition to your other duties? What drew you to this case? Why was it so important to you?
Well, this was and still is so important to me on very different levels. My family's from Houston, and they lived in the Heights area. I grew up was in Austin, but I was tied to Houston. We still had relatives there. And then I also, at the time that I went in the cooler, my son was an older teenager. And I had not ever heard of the Houston mass murders. But the minute that I got one of those boxes out and realized what it was about, that was it. I had to work on them.
And I want to talk about that first boy that you were able to identify, Randy Harvey. What was his story?
So Randy Harvey was a 15-year-old boy who lived in kind of on the fringes of the Heights near a set of railroad tracks. And every day he went to work at a gas station off of Ella Boulevard. It was around 2 miles or so to the gas station. He had to ride on either Shepherd or go on some path that went along White Oak Bayou to get there. And he took his bike. he lived with his mother and his little sister, and he was used to doing that. He wasn't afraid. And he went one day on his bike, and his sister waved goodbye to him, and then he disappeared. He never made it to work. And his mother tried to report him missing, but the police at the time did very little. There's only a one-page missing persons report, and it appears they really never followed up.
Mhm.
So that's a report that Sharon found years later when she was looking through the files, trying to figure out if there were boys who had been reported missing, but then who had never been identified. Randy's name jumped out early, I think.
Yes, it did.
And then
Mhm.
later on, his sister called the morgue twice. And so there were old, while you were out phone messages from his little sister that were really compelling. And it appeared, she'd never gotten an answer. Sharon answered.
Poignant. She keeps trying. She knows that this is important and nobody will pay attention to her.
But in trying to identify him, all the work, I mean, it's so impressive, from the autopsies, going through databases, hunting for family members in old phone books so you can do DNA testing, and all of this and more over the course of literally years. What was the big break? Or was it more about all these different pieces coming together?
Well, I think that it was more everything coming together, but I did have the opportunity to talk to the family, Randy's family, and I
Yeah.
spoke with his sister. And that was one of the reasons that he was right at the beginning of the investigation here for me.
If I can kind of put it in order, because Sharon
Sure.
is, I think, minimizing her own amazing work. So she first examined the bones, and one of the breakthroughs, I think, came early in that examination. She determined that this boy was probably younger and taller than the original autopsy suggested based on modern databases, information she could consult in the 2000s that wouldn't have been available in 1970. So when she looked at that very first box of bones, it actually turned out that the characteristics of that body appeared to maybe match better than any other body to that one-page minimal typed missing persons report she had found with Randy Harvey's name and the fact that he was 15 and that he was about 6 feet tall and really skinny. In the box, she saw a belt that had a 30-inch waistline. That's a skinny young boy. So those things led her to think, hey, I really need to try to find this young girl who left this poignant message. And she starts to look for Lenore Harvey. And it's hard because Randy Harvey is actual Randall with an ELL. And it takes a while for her to figure out where his family is. And she goes through a lot of old obituaries before she finally finds someone who's a distant relative who says, yes, I know where Lenore Harvey lives. Here's her name and phone number. Here's her new name.
Mhm.
So, of course, as we know, a lot of times women change their last names, and Lenore had a different last name. So Sharon found her address and phone number after a lot of sleuthing and a lot of scientific investigation.
What was it like in that moment, being able to give them some kind of answer and knowing that you had helped?
It was amazing to me, and I was hooked on these cases after that, because I felt like it really is a community service. But I have to say that working on those cases and getting the identifications that did come in is like the crowning achievement of my life. And I will never do anything again that means as much to me as that work did.
The other thing the families were able to do was have memorial services. So Randy's family had a memorial service for him. They played his favorite songs. They displayed pictures of him. They celebrated his life. And that's something they would not have been able to do if it hadn't been for Sharon's work.
Well, thank you. That makes I started to tear up, so hush. But thank you.
And it wasn't just Randy. I mean, he's one of these lost boys, and every single one of them has such an important story, even the ones that haven't been fully identified or confirmed yet. But I want to ask you, Lisa, like, this work that Sharon did, and then your own investigative work on this book, I mean, it all sheds new light on these murders, from the body count to other ways the killer, Dean Corll, abused his victims. How would you kind of sum up how these new findings change our understanding of the Candyman?
So this case in the 70s was already an incredibly notorious case. It made international news. The Texas Rangers declared it to be the worst serial killing. They didn't even have that term yet, but that's what we would call it today in national history, with 27 known victims. What we know now through Sharon's work is that there were at least 30 victims who are based on identifications, and there are remains that suggest there could be as many as 5 more, 3 on the beach and 2 perhaps in the boat shed. There also was information related to these identifications, the kids that were identified by Sharon, the 6 you mentioned, and then 2 more where there were new revelations about their identities. Those cases brought to light the fact that Coral was involved in an international porn ring that was actually selling and distributing photos of young boys from Houston, including 11 of the murder victims. And that ring continued to operate for several years after these murders were discovered. So there were other men that were involved in this group. Coral also, he used a variety of methods to lure those teenage kids to him. He preyed on kids who already knew him from his candy shop. He had his accomplices snatch kids off the street or try to invite them to parties. But he also lured them by offering some of them money to take their pictures. And all that was kind of hidden at the time. And I think that really relates today to the stigma that surrounds male victims of sex crimes. And we know a lot more about human trafficking. We have, registries for sex offenders. But back then, that was all unknown, and those dangers are still very real today, and these crimes are still underreported. And that same kind of stigma that affected some of the surviving victims, who I also interviewed,
Mhm.
keeps boys from coming forward today.
I wanted to ask about that, taboo of boys being sexually abused and men being victims of sex crimes. And, another aspect is how this might have impacted the gay community because Dean Corll was gay and that kind of came out in the aftermath. Any thoughts of how this impacted the gay community in Houston?
I did a lot of research into, the response of the gay community. And what was interesting, I think, in general, is that Houstonians, gay and straight, wanted to kind of close this case as soon as possible because for the gay community, they were already dealing with homophobia and, people who were violent against gays. They didn't want to recognize Dean Corll at all as part of their community. And I understand why. Dean Corll certainly didn't admit to people that he was gay. Um, and the gay community in Houston was just trying to become, politically active. And so, dealing with Dean Corll was not something that really served their purposes. And Houstonians in general did not want to be known as a murder town. The DA and the police chief were all saying this could happen anywhere. They were trying to close the case, prosecute Corll's 2 teenage accomplices who had led them to
Mhm.
bodies, and not delve in more deeply into the forces that had created Dean Corll or a potential adult accomplices. It was in the service of the community and the reputation of the community to kind of move on and go on. And I would argue that today that one of the problems with that is that ended up then doing this huge disservice to the unidentified victims, who then there was no pressure or no continued support to try to figure out who they were. And in fact, some of the families were sort of reluctant to keep pushing because of that stigma
Mhm.
around these cases.
Yeah, it kind of stopped that pressure and forward movement until Sharon came and took it up.
Absolutely.
I know, Sharon, in your work, there are still some pending cases, but how many do you think are really out there? What do you think the real number is?
I really have no comprehension of what that real number might be. I know there are more. I don't know where they are. And the fact that it's been that many years, they're probably not easy to find or even recognize as human at this point by someone who's not trained. So I find that terribly distressing for the families who never got their answer.
I want to go back to just one thing you said. I think you said there was an adult accomplice.
Well, the people who were involved in the porn ring, the ones who had photos of 11 victims, um, One of those people was a man named Roy Ames. He was named as a potential suspect. The police never appeared to have questioned him at the time or even after when the photos were found. And I found evidence that Roy Ames and 2 other men were part of that porn ring that had those photos of the boys, and that there was evidence that even after Roy Ames went to federal prison, that the other men continued to exploit teenage boys in Houston.
The #1 selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, out of botulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
At Patron, we craft our tequila using high-quality natural ingredients without additives. No sweeteners, no extracts, no secrets. In fact, Patron's secret ingredient is that we have no secret ingredients. Just 100% additive-free tequila, made with 100% Weber Blue Agave, water, and thyme. Patron, 100% additive-free tequila. Visit patrontequila.com to learn more. The perfect way to enjoy Patron is responsibly. Copyright 2025, imported by Patron Spirits Company, Coral Gables, Florida. Tequila 40% ABV.
You know, speaking about accomplices, the 2 main ones that we know about were, as you said, these teenage boys who Coral used and groomed to lure their friends and classmates to be tortured and killed. And, you know, in reading the book, one of the parts that was the hardest for me to understand was, why did these 2 teenagers join in such a terrible crime? I mean, Sharon, you met and talked with both of them in prison. And one of them has since passed away, but how do you square that in your mind?
Well, in my mind, it was a different time period for one thing. And so some of boys, their families were not really knowing or noticing what they're doing in their spare time. And all they have to do is find somebody like Dean Corll who really attracted them to being a part of his group. And I just think that teenage individuals are easily swayed by someone who seems to have all those answers.
You know, these days we're aware of grooming, right? The process of grooming that pedophiles use. And David Brooks, first met Dean Corll when he was 10 years old, 10 or 11.
And he was one of the accomplices.
Yeah, he was one of the accomplices. And his grandmother lived near Corll's candy shop, which was right next to Helms Elementary School in the Heights. And he met Corll there. And Corll opened his candy shop up after hours and invited boys just to come and hang out. And so particularly boys who maybe were children of divorce, parents who were separated, or in some cases had histories of abuse, would show up there. And their parents, some of their parents knew that about Corll and approved of it. They weren't thinking that this person might be, using and abusing their children or paying their children for photos or for sex, even though that's what was happening to David Brooks from a very young age. So David was really groomed for a long time and kind of molded into this accomplice for Corll. He lived with Dean Corll. He was estranged from his parents. He claims he never killed anyone, but obviously he participated in luring them to Corll's house. He knew what happened to these kids, and he claims that, he wasn't involved in that, but he did bury them. That's what he always said. Mm-hmm. Now, on the other hand, he was the one who lured Elmer Wayne Henley to the house.
Yeah, that's the other accomplice. He's actually still alive in prison today.
Elmer Wayne Henley was abused by his father. He had been shot at. He had a different upbringing, and he seemed to take to the idea of becoming a killer. His friends told me that he became sort of enamored of the idea of becoming a hitman. And I think that's what Sharon thought when she interviewed him too, that he had got a thrill out of it, thrill out of killing.
He became an important person, which he had never been an important person. And he had the laxity of the parents that he could just go anywhere, anytime, just about. And so he felt like he was being a grown up, I think. And he was enjoying the freedom. And he also fell under the spell, I think.
I mean, I interviewed, a lot of people who knew a lot of these kids. And one of the people I interviewed was named Bernie Milligan. He was a graduate of Heights High School. He knew one of the murder victims, Frank Aguirre, really well. And he says that he was chased by Dean Corll one night when he was coming home. But he also says that he believes his friend, Frank Aguirre, who was killed by Corll. Bernie claims that he thinks Henley specifically picked Frank Aguirre to die because he wanted to date Frank's girlfriend.
Yeah, the girlfriend angle, that was another really disturbing part. And there's so many different layers to this, but the fact that there were other boys, other teenagers who you talked to who brushed alongside this ring and had these near misses, I mean, it's truly terrifying. There's another thing you mentioned, Lisa. You mentioned all these details of, Heights High School, Helms Elementary, the streets that these boys lived on. It was both fascinating and kind of creepy to read about these descriptions of the Heights, especially for people who live there or spend a lot of time there. How would you describe the Heights back in the 1970s?
The Heights was more run down than it is today. It certainly was, still a historic neighborhood, still filled with families who, were living in small 2-bedroom houses. The bungalows we're familiar with now that sell for a lot of money were not that expensive then. And there were a lot of families in the 70s where the dads were coming back from World War II, some cases traumatized. There was an awareness of that. There was a lot of domestic violence, but there also still was a sense in the Heights, even in the 70s, that kids were pretty much safe if they were just walking to the bowling alley or to the swimming pool or riding their bike to work like Randy Harvey was.
Yeah. And like the families were making these calls, but the police didn't really do a lot. And so the adults didn't really put the pieces together, even though one school had like 11 missing boys. But, some of the kids, some of the teenagers did have a sense of, oh, that boy disappeared. Oh, that friend disappeared. And there was like at some level, some awareness with the kids that there were some bad things happening, right? Or am I overstating that?
No, I think certainly kids, especially kids who went to Hamilton Junior High or Hogg Junior High, they noticed that an abnormally large number of their classmates had gone missing. I mean, and these were kids that were of a similar age. And one of the stories in the book is from Nita Bodiford, who remembers how she saw her junior high boyfriend, Michael Balch, in downtown Heights at a cafe. And the last words he said to her before he vanished off the face of the earth were, "I think I know what happened to my older brother. His brother had been missing. Dean Corll killed 2 sets of brothers. And Michael's older brother, Billy, had already been missing for a couple years when Nita saw him, and she knew it. And he said, I'm going to find out. I'm going to do something." And then he disappeared. So Nita, certainly always wondered what the heck happened to Michael, what happened to Billy. So there were a number of kids who lived within only a few blocks, for example, of Elmer Wayne Henley, one of the 2 accomplices. And of course, the people who knew them wondered what was going on. What was going on?
Yeah, there just seemed to be like this disconnect between sort of this adult world and the children's world. And it just reminded me that how sometimes teenagers, young people have a sense of intuition. I mean, obviously also can be manipulated and groomed as we see, but also have, their own awareness.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that the teenagers, some members of the teenagers of the Heights, people like Bernie Milligan, people like Nita really knew something was really wrong. They didn't imagine how horrifying it was, but they knew something was wrong. And they also just felt unempowered. They didn't feel like the night Bernie was chased through the heights to his house, he did not feel empowered to have his mother call the police and tell them about, and Bernie was a good kid. He was not a drinker. He was on the track team. He was not a smoker. He had just been working all day at an ice cream store. But he didn't think that police would believe him as a teenager. He didn't think Houston police wanted to hear from teenagers, and that in fact, if he'd called them, he would probably have been under suspicion as somebody trying to turn in a man who had chased him through the streets in a convertible.
And I think he was right, don't you?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
there was other people who saw and heard Coral do odd things, who told the stories years later. And sometimes, like you said, Laura, it was maybe just an intuition. Something was really wrong, something really bizarre they saw at a party, or something bizarre they heard, but they couldn't put all the pieces together, and they certainly didn't feel empowered to talk to the police.
Yeah. But as the boys began to disappear and families began to report, their sons or their brothers missing, how did the police respond when they would make reports?
Well, I have to say, from what I've read in the police reports, they're runaways. They're just runaways. They're drug users. Their parents don't really know that they're getting into these things, and that's why they're reporting them missing.
Well, they had a lot of reported missing persons for sure, but they didn't have the protocols that we have today about, Amber Alerts.
Mhm.
Why would Randy Harvey leave without collecting his paycheck from work? Where was his bike? Why didn't he ever phone his mother or sister? There were a lot of red flags that would have raised more issues today. And some of these families really tried to get out the word. One father talked about, trying to camp on the doorstep of the Houston police. Another family hired a private detective and put up flyers everywhere. And yet they still didn't get attention. In the day, there was a police chief who was really regressive, tended to label teenagers as hippies. When these murders were found, made all kinds of excuses about why his department was not to blame. The department is different, today, and it really changed in the 70s, I think, partly because of this case. That police chief left almost right after these murders were discovered.
But I still maintain that a lot of this is because they were boys. If girls had been missing, they would have been searching the streets. The police would have been out there. But back in that day, especially, they can take care of themselves. They're boys. They're males. They'll be fine.
Yeah, there wasn't much awareness of the idea that teenage boys could be victims of sex crimes.
No.
With this case, did it help create any new laws or policies to prevent this kind of crime or to help families more when their children go missing?
No, really what happened is Houston officials and Harris County officials wanted to say, end of chapter, Houston is not a murder town. Dallas is the place where JFK was assassinated. Austin is the place where the Bell Tower murders happened. Houston is Space City. They just closed the books on this. And it was really only after, several years later when this major porn ring was discovered, led by Roy Ames. And I would argue that the police already knew about that porn ring when these murders were discovered, but they chose not to act until the publicity had sort of died down. There was never really any connection made with Roy Ames when he was arrested and all those pictures were found of the victims. There was an effort to quash the publicity. But those crimes, his incredibly huge international network of pornography, got attention to the issue of the lack of laws to protect teenagers from pornography and from pedophiles. And so there were state and federal hearings regarding that pornographer, regarding Roy Ames and other people who are doing similar things like him. And in 1977, Texas, for the first time, passes a law aimed at child pornography. But there's no connection made publicly then with Dean Corll and in fact, in court filings, you can see that Roy Ames lawyered up and tried to keep it quiet too. He didn't want anyone to be able to raise the idea that he had been Corll's friend or that he had been part of taking pictures of those murder victims.
Sharon, you did such amazing work to restore the identity of these lost boys. But there are still so many missing people in Houston. And even today, we have nearly 300 unidentified bodies. For families out there who are missing loved ones, what advice do you have for them?
Well, first of all, I'm sure they have reported them missing to police and the sheriff's office. If they have not, that's your first option. But I would continue to contact the medical examiner's office and ask for their case lists. Have you had any new cases come in of individuals that would match my son? Because he has not come home.
And if somebody's been missing for long enough, if it's a juvenile or an adult, you can try to submit your DNA, a DNA sample, a familial DNA sample, or submit their dental records through CODIS or NamUs, which are two federal government databases. And NamUs is searchable. You can, as a member of the public, you can search the public portion of NamUs to try to see if there's any people who have been reported unidentified remains that might match the person you are missing in your family. And I think I would say just keep trying, because think of these families who Sharon met, 30, 40 years after the fact. They had never given up. And a lot of these people had been trapped in kind of a frozen grief, an unresolved not knowingness. And for them to get answers was an amazing thing. Other people are waiting for answers too.
Thank you for sharing those details. How do you each think that this crime changed Houston as a city?
We've talked about how, people in the Heights were affected, but of course, these killers also preyed on boys in, Spring Branch, Garden Oaks, Pasadena, South Houston. One boy was picked up just outside the Houston Galleria, which was under construction at the time. There are this whole generation of teenagers who are sort of collectively traumatized by this, gay and straight, people who never really felt safe again. The people who were best friends of these kids, a lot of them had never told their stories before I interviewed them for the book. And I think, what I'm trying to do in this book is explain how it shaped a whole generation of Houstonians that knew these kids and shook the foundations of what they believed in about their city to the core.
So I think Lisa gave a really good answer, but based on my family members, that some still live there, all of a sudden it was not the glorious Houston that they thought it had been. It has a dark side too, and an underbelly too. And members of my family who still live there, they are much more careful about where their children go and knowing where they are. And I think that was probably a good part of what happened, that people are realizing that bad things can happen and not going to watch out for it.
Lisa, is there anything else that you think listeners should know about where things stand today with the memory of this case?
Recently, as I tell in the book, Pasadena Public Works tore down the house where Corll tortured and killed his very last victims, and where Corll himself was killed by Elmer Wayne Henley in August 1973. There has been a movement to try to create some sort of a monument to Corll's victims, either in Pasadena or maybe even in the Heights, recognizing this huge loss of life and trying to figure out a way to kind of turn it around from focusing on the serial killer to focusing on the need for victims like this to obtain justice and their families to get answers. And I really hope that that proposal is taken up again. It's something I've heard other people talking about, but no action has been taken on it.
I would certainly like to see that too. And I hope it happens before the older moms and dads are all gone.
Well, I want to thank you both for helping put all these pieces together. Sharon, with your work as a forensic anthropologist, and Lisa, with your investigation as a journalist. Thank you both so much for joining us.
You're welcome. And it was a good thing for me to be able to do this. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Laura. It was a pleasure to tell the story for CityCast Houston and for Houstonians.
That was Sharon Derrick. She's now an associate professor at Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi and coordinates their forensic sciences program. And also Lisa Olson, who's an award-winning investigative journalist and author based in Houston. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with 3 of your friends who love true crime. And give us a rating and review. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And if you want to learn even more about the Lost Boys of Houston and the Candyman serial killer, you can hear Lisa talk about her book tomorrow at her book launch at Murder by the Book, or catch her later this month at Barnes & Noble in Baybrook. Check out our show notes for those details. And while you're there, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter, Hey Houston, so you can get even more tips on what to do around town in your inbox every weekday. That will do it for today. I'm Laura Eisensee, and I hope you learned something new.